September the 9th, 2007. A magnitude 6.0 earthquake hit Rome hard. The Colosseum took some damage. An underground catacomb sunk as the earth shifted, revealing dozens of pieces pottery, all of which contained decomposing scrolls. The Catholic Church quickly closed off the area and removed the scrolls to their archives. Anthropologists and archaeologists from all over the world came to get a glimpse of the writings, but not until the diocese had them looked at first by their hired experts. Once again Mr. Dayton was called to be part of this secret team. He was the first to arrive from New York. He was taken directly to Vatican City, to an atmospheric-controlled room in the basement of the basilica. It had glass walls with Aramaic and theologian scripts painted onto the glass, to protect the room from evil spirits. The glass room was inside a larger, circular room with stone masonry walls. Crosses hung from the ceiling all around the room. The archdiocese feared the scrolls' writings needed to be contained. All the papyrus had been removed from the broken pottery and meticulously placed on two long tables. Dayton felt the archdiocese knew more than they were saying. His heart was pounding as he leaned over the first stream of scrolled papyrus. It seemed to be talking once again of a godly hidden city, holding a great temple in the center of this city. Describing a gate of gold with several precious stones inlaid in it, with great ominous walls. Dayton wondered why the walls were so unusually high. What were they trying to keep out? The words Lilith and Maenad once again were written on the scrolls. With his heart threatening to beat out of his chest with excitement, he read on. For the Lord has called down warriors to prepare for the last great battle of mankind. It shall be a dreary battle like no other that has been fought on other worlds. Secrets will unfold before man's eyes, and they will see clearly the evil in their midst. They will run frightened to and fro with nowhere to hide. Dayton stopped for a moment and stood straight and looked at the bishops in the room, who were intensely followed his every word. They knew, as did Dayton, that these scrolls matched the ones they had in their vaults, except these scrolls gave a more in-depth forecast. They had been watching the child of Satan who would usher in what was written before them. He knew that the church would never let the public view these writings. The church prepared a second room of less informative scrolls containing the beginning of the Roman Empire and invited all foreigners to review those and report the finding to the world. Dayton was joined by two others. Clifford Geertz, an American of cultural and ideologies anthropologist who was world-famous and greatly trusted by the Vatican, and Parki Saba, an Egyptian archaeologist and linguist of ancient language. They began to determine the factual accounts on the papyrus. Dayton enjoyed the challenge of intelligence with these two men. All three bent over the outlaid papyrus and began. Dayton filled the others in on his readings before Parki and Clifford entered the room. Clifford began on the scroll nearest to him. Behold, all ye inhabitants of the world, a great darkness is waxing your way. For it shall not be stopped, as it is foretold in heaven. Bow your heads, for the wind shall snap them off like diseased twigs. Kneel before one God, all men that believe. Angels will be sent to protect thee. Fear the body of Damascus, for it shall be tainted and rotten with scorpions and worms and all sort of vermin. Look the other way as he passes, and you shall be saved. Dayton was astonished as Clifford deciphered this context of the scroll. All were silent in the room. Right that it gave the Antichrist's name, Damascus. The others thought it referred to the land of Damascus. Dayton knew better. Parki looked farther down the long table and began to interpret a scroll. Listen to this. It says here that this Antichrist will take a bride. Strange, is it a symbolic meaning or actually a bride? Dayton moved closer and studied the script. Many portions of it were completely disintegrated. The man who is dark inside, who is brought into the world to close down the world, he shall take a bride that the people will love, and love him through her. She is chosen. Clifford Geertz interrupted. So this Antichrist will marry a woman that the world will adore like a Princess Diana? That would make a great deal of sense, and clever on the part of this Antichrist. An alarm went off. Confusion hit the contained room. The bishops began a chant in Latin, holding tightly to their ornate crosses that they held up in front of their bodies. They saw many priests lined up on the outside of the glass room as if to protect those inside. Dayton quickly grabbed the papyrus that contained the information about the bride. He senses that evil was close. He shredded it into small bits, and then out of sheer panic, ate it. Parky looked at him in fear and disgust. "Why did you do that?" Dayton had no time to answer when a dark fume surrounded the priests in the outside of their glass room. The bishops inside the contained room were chanting in unison now and louder. The priests' heads were severed off as the dark mist floated by them. Yells and screams prevailed at their deaths, to protect God's word. Blood ran down the glass walls. Silence fell upon the room. Clifford had backed up to Parky and Dayton. They were helpless to such an evil entity. It surrounded the outside glass encasement, and paced back and forth. Dayton could sense its confusion. He returned to deciphering the papyrus. Parky whispered, "Really? You're reading the script now. If that dark mist wants this information, then we have a responsibility to destroy it, but I am going to read as much as I can. Does anyone have a match?" Clifford, an avid pipe smoker, brought out his lighter. The black mist moved more quickly now, sensing a plan was in the making. "Light the papyrus on fire," Dayton exclaimed. Parky and Clifford lit the papyruses. They burned quickly. The dark dense mist surrounded the glass wall completely, squeezing the round formation of windows. They began to bow and slowly crackle. Dayton deciphered more papyrus about the Antichrist, and a symbol that was to be etched on the back of the head of Damascus's bride for protection against him. Dayton grabbed Clifford's lighter and lit that portion of the papyrus on fire. Most all were on fire now. No smoke alarms or water deferred their mission. A loud screech pierced their ears. The glass gave way and burst like a bomb into the room. Dayton and Parky took cover under a table. Clifford was not so lucky. Glass struck him in the forehead, killing him instantly. The bishops stood 3 strong and stayed on course with God's Latin chant. Glass covered the floor. Dayton and Parky stayed under the table, unable to look away from their dead companion. They heard footsteps crunch on the glass. The feet were covered in black boots, and the red gown covered most of the black pants tucked into the boots. The cloth almost identically matched the bishops, except for the color. Dayton crawled out from under the table to face the evil. He would not die a coward. Parky, frozen in fear, stayed underneath the long table. To Dayton's astonishment, the man standing before them was a handsome blonde-haired man in robes of the satanic priesthood. He smiled at Dayton. The bishops nervously held out their crosses, and chanted louder and louder to rebuke the man of Samuel. The man spoke in a deep voice with an echoing growl. "I am Menad, Samuel's first son. I am the savior of this world." He raised his hand, and with a whisk all the crosses that dangled from the ceiling flew like daggers into the outside room's stone wall, thus embedding them in rows. The fear in the bishops was obvious. "Kneel before your king." With his hand extended, he forced the bishops to kneel. He turned and looked at the burned papyrus and held his other hand over the remains. He growled and snarled. He looked at Dayton with red eyes. Dayton looked away. A small wind picked up in the room. Another man entered the glass-riddled room. He wore a long white gown that touched the floor and was barefoot. The glass did not cut his feet. He had a blue tasseled sash tied about his waist. His skin was dark. He had short hair with tight black curls. He released the bishops from the power of Menad. He ordered them to exit, and they ran. Parky remained motionless under the table, while Dayton stood observing. The man in white spoke to Menad. "I am Adam. I am sent here by God to cast you from this holy place." Dayton's eyes grew wide as he looked upon the first man of earth. Adam grabbed Menad's left hand in a firm patriarchal grip and threw him against the wall, where he dissipated. Adam, not looking at Dayton, said, "You must never reveal what has happened here. If you do, you will surely die." He then knelt down and touched Parky on the forehead. He went limp and collapsed to the floor, and then Adam disappeared into thin air. Dayton stood alone in the room. Gold Plates Translation 2012. In a secret chamber, 3 gold plates were found. It belonged to St. Anthony, an Egyptian monk. He was 105 years old when he died in 356 AD. His disciples prepped the secret burial cave in the desert. The plates were bought by the Catholic Church in 1791 and hidden in the catacombs in Rome. Dayton spent last year studying this ancient script and wrote it into a story for the Pope. Dayton was uncomfortable that Menad had seen him and was aware of his work. After the event with Menad in 2007, Dayton developed a nasty cough. The Vatican physicians were unable to determine any medical reason. They told him it was due to extreme stress and he should try to relax. Dayton's nights were long, with nightmares of demons attacking him as they did to St. Anthony of Egypt, who fought the dark entities for most of his ordained life. He used a thick leather belt to whip himself to keep his spirit faithfully erect. Dayton was not so staunch in rituals. He began to drink at night until passed out. His appearance began to exhibit the stress and disposition of his late-night torments. He had just celebrated his 60th birthday. Dayton planned to retire. Dayton's translation of the 3 gold plates, which were gifted by the collective Archdiocese of Rome to the Pope on his 80th birthday, Lilith was the first woman in the first Eden created by God. This was the Eden of Adam and Lilith. They resided in the beauty and pleasure of Eden, which God had created for them. Lilith was a strong female and wanted equality with Adam, who was God's favorite. As God taught Adam and Lilith of the truth of his laws, Lilith became unsettled at her role. She did not want Adam to rule over her and the garden. She wanted to be by his side and be equal in every way, and her anxiety grew as she was taught to be submissive to Adam and the ways of heaven. One day, Lilith walked in the garden with the lions and panthers. She stopped at an awesome sight to behold, the tree of God that was beautiful and bore desirable fruit. The tree was large and the fruit glistened and was desirous to her. Suddenly the panther looked up at her and spoke, "Do you want the fruit of that tree?" Lilith nodded. She was intoxicated with the thought. The panther said, "Then eat of the fruit of that tree, it is most desirous and delicious to the taste." Lilith replied to the panther, saying, "I cannot, for God forbade me from partaking." The panther slithered around her legs. "Did you know that Adam eats the fruit of that tree, and God delighteth in it?" Lilith looked down at the panther and grabbed his face. "How do you know this?" "I have seen him. Come tonight. Let's hide and watch Adam partake of the fruit of God's tree." The panther pulled his face from Lilith's grasp. Lilith felt anger for the first time, along with jealousy. She was hurt that God and Adam kept a secret from her. She ran deep into the garden and wept. That night Lilith and the panther lay in wait, for Adam did approach the tree, touching the fruit thereof, and finding joy at the sight. He then picked a fruit and did eat. Lilith, aghast and fuming in anger, ran to Adam, yelling at him that he did not share of the fruit of this tree that God has commanded them not to partake of. She then turned and yelled into the heavens, while she grabbed many fruits from the tree thereof and held them in her arms, demanding God to come forth. God's voice shook the tree. "What is it, Lilith? You favor Adam over me," she yelled. "How could you let Adam partake of the fruit of this tree and deny me? Adam is beloved by God." Lilith dropped the fruit and cried, "And what about me?" God grew angry with her and cast her out of the Garden of Eden to walk the earth for all its days. God then made a woman from Adam's rib and called her Eve. Chapter 3. Metamorn. Year 2012, the hidden city Metamorn, a city veiled, deep in South America and surrounded by the forests of Lilith. Only a few miles away was Eden, where man began, also surrounded by Lilith's evil forest. Metria was protected by large walls surrounding the city. It held the last great temple of God, built by Adam's first tribe. It resembled a city of the ancient Mayans, yet with the vastness of metropolitan design. The gates to the city were gold-plated and stood 3 stories high. The outer walls were 4 stories high to keep out the wrath of Lilith and all her demons, monsters, and children that drank the blood of man. Ancient scriptures carved around the edges warned all evil things not to enter or they would die. In a row across the top, precious stones were inlaid, representing the levels of sainthood. The first levels of stones were amethyst, carved square and 4 by 4. The next level was diamonds forming a triangle, and of the same dimensions. Level 3 at the midpoint was emeralds, crisp and clear in color, round and smaller than the other jewels. The last stones embedded in the gate, which lined across the lower part, were tiger's eye, with a brilliant star shining in each to represent the all-seeing eye of God. Inside the gates were thousands of people, but a few were the young warriors known as reincarnates. They received this name by returning to earth after the first evolution of man. They are the fiercest warriors from heaven, who fought Samuel, Menad and empty misguided spirits. When these spirits were cast out, heaven regained full power and beauty once again. Each of heaven's 24 warriors had known Samuel personally, for he had been their brother in the priesthood and held the highest office in God's kingdom, next to his sibling, Jehovah. Samuel was innovative and believed he could make this world more efficient and effective for the rest of those spirits who were to evolve in earth life. Samuel presented his ideas to God. He became despondent when God refused his plans and conceptions. Samuel returned to the spirits in the spirit world and caused much disdain with his gossip and crafty speech. He swayed thousands to his ideas and ways. They began to talk of evil and were negative about God and his elect, and finally rebuked his priesthoods and keys to his kingdom. Samuel developed his own priesthoods and power that would unlock his kingdom of the damned, which mimicked God's. Tension grew in the levels of heaven. Followers of Samuel argued with the spirits that followed God, and a battle ensued. Samuel and Menad crossed the line, and destroyed several spirits that extinguished any chance they had for exaltation. This angered God, like a lioness whose cubs had been killed by predators. The 3 strongest and fearless warriors were brother, Kalob, Jijah, and Phelm. The brothers fought the rebellious and casted out Samuel and his son, Menad. Kalob and Jijah never died, which allowed them to walk between earth and heaven at any given time. Phelm of Holy Spirit could only exist on earth as a reincarnate. Reincarnates were ordained to follow a human. When the human reaches the age of 20, they divulge the truth of their existence to them through a patriarchal blessing upon their heads, and give them talents and mystical powers. Each human would be given their own birthright to use these powers in the battle with the Dark Ones. Finally, God's warriors were called upon to lead their sheep to battle against Samuel, Menad, and his evil followers, and cast them down to earth, until God could bring dominion back to heaven. Tallulah was a 12-year-old girl who loved to challenge the rules of Metria in almost every way, and left her parents exhausted. She and her best friend, Cleo, ran past the guards of Metria's gates, which were open mid-morning for warriors to venture out and hunt for the day's meat. Metria's dwellers grew their own food and were vegetarians, except for the warriors. Cleo and Tallulah, for the first time, worked up the nerve to sneak out after the warriors and investigate the forest. The forest was made up of lush ferns, mosses, and extravagant redwoods that towered into the clear sky. The girls spotted a clearing full of aster flowers, all colors, red, purple, white, and the brightest yellow they had ever seen. Cleo and Tallulah giggled as they skipped into the opening to pick flowers to take back home. Suddenly Tallulah lifted her head into the air and sniffed like a wild animal in all directions. Cleo, Do you smell that? Talula's eyes darted all around them, alarmed. Smell what? The asters don't have a scent, Cleo said. No, it's something else, something bad. Talula glimpsed out of the corner of her eye a motion in the trees. We have to go right now, something is in the forest. Can't you smell that? For the last time, smell what? Cleo sniffed. I can't smell anything. Cleo gathered her flowers, smiling at her beautiful bouquet. Her blonde, whimsical hair fell into her eyes. All of a sudden she too smelled something foul and evil. Cleo dropped her flowers and froze in fear as a dark shadow ran behind the redwoods. Talula grabbed her friend's arm and said, "Stay close to me." Both girls crouched silently among the asters. Then they saw them. There were at least 5. They emerged from the shadows and into the light. They were hideous, some sort of twisted animal. Their heads were like a wolf with a long nose, and rows of dagger-sharp teeth, and their gold eyes were of pure evil. The golden eyes slightly gyrated when looking at the girls. Their bodies moved with the grace of a panther, with long tails that swished violently back and forth. They permeated the foul stench of death. The girls backed away from the creatures, holding each other tightly. Cleo shook from head to toe. Cleo began to hum. She did that when she was nervous to calm herself. Talula had studied all the evil entities of Lilith. She recognized them as the Cochreans, made from the witchery of Lilith, to not only kill their prey, but also be the ever-seeing eyes of Lilith. Each creature could decipher life from human auras, to recognize if they were the reincarnates that Lilith loved to kill in order to upset God's plan. The Cochreans paced in a circle around the girls, studying them and their auras, their gold eyes spinning as their tongues hung out of their mouths. They salivated. Talula reached into her pocket and took out a stone about the size of a cookie. She carried several in her pocket in case they ran into evil animals in the forest. She'd studied these creatures in the ancient books from the library. Each Cochrean had a white triangle of fur between its front legs on its chest, just below the neck. If you hit that area with force they would dissipate. It was their only weakness. Talula quietly snuck 2 rocks into Cleo's palm and said, "Aim for the white spot on their chest. It will kill them." Cleo responded in a whisper, "Are you sure?" Talula nodded. Both girls took aim. Several of the creatures glanced behind them and emitted growls and snorts. They turned away from the girls, and their panting grew more arduous and rapid, foam drizzling from their fanged mouths. Swoosh! Arrows appeared out of nowhere, striking the Cochreans in their white triangle spots and dissipating 3 instantly into ashes. The other 2 Cochreans fled into the woods, disappearing from sight. Kalob and Gija appeared with Wient and his twin Reem. "You missed, brother. You hit that Cochrean in its hindquarters," Reem said to his twin. Standing 6'3", with rippling muscles, Wient wore his long hair to his lower back, fastened in a tail wrapped in suede. A necklace of Cochrean teeth hung on his bare chest. "Brother, that was not my arrow that hit its hinds, it was yours. Mine flew straight into its triangle." Reem chuckled. He was the spitting image of Wient. It was hard to tell them apart. Kalob ignored the brothers and walked to the girls. Cleo began to cry and whimper. Kalob stood over them, blocking out the warmth of the sun. Kalob, also over 6 feet tall, was a direct descendant of the Mescalero Apache Indians. His lineage predated into the lost 12 tribes of Israel, one honored in heaven. "Why are you girls here? You could have been killed if Gija hadn't heard you talking." Kalob placed his fists on his hips, which made Cleo cry harder. Talula sighed at her friend's weakness and looked directly at Kalob. "We knew it was wrong to come outside the gates without an escort, but we wanted to see the forest for ourselves." She lowered her head in shame. Cleo piped up. "She made me come." Talula gasped at her friend. "I did not. Come on, girls, we will get you back to me to mourn." Jija smirked at Kalob in amusement. "We will stay and hunt for more food. See if we can catch any more Kokrians." Reem patted his brother on the back and they ran off in the direction of the Kokrian. The girls went to bed without dinner that night, their parents angry at the disobedience of their daughters. Kalob and Jija were worried that Lilith would decipher that Talula was the reincarnate of Felm. It could make it harder for Talula when she became a full-fledged warrior at 20. Lilith gathered her blood-drinking children once a year to report on their clandestine cults and followers. Once they convened, they would also attack the city of Metamorn, and thus the grand city was always prepared for them. The inhabitants stocked up on holy arrows. These arrows came directly from the heavens and appeared in Adam's holy temple, which stood like a main structure in the center of Metamorn. These arrows destroyed vampires. The great city had thousands of trained archers who at any given time stood on the edge of the city walls and produced a wave of fluent arrows to bring down several hundred vampires. On occasion, a vampire or two would break through the arrow barrier and swoop down into the city. They tried to grab a child, for they were the most delectable, their blood as sweet as nectar. Every year, Lilith's children lost hundreds of followers on the attack of Metamorn. They couldn't resist the temptation to harm the great city. Metamorn usually had minimal losses as the gates and great walls kept out the vampires. This year, Tabas, Lilith's eldest, approached his mother with venom in his voice. "We need to destroy Metamorn now. I have a plan. At night, we will tunnel under the city and attack them from the ground. They will never expect it. We can finally destroy the city and get on with taking over the world." Lilith rose from her lounge couch and walked to her son and kissed him on the cheek. She smiled and said, "Be patient, Tabas. I have a better plan, not only to take over this world, but to overthrow the universe. All will call me Queen God, ruling over thousands of worlds. Wait, my son, I have a superior plan than just Metamorn." Her eyes glowed green as she divulged her secret intent, as yet undisclosed to Menad and his evil followers. Tabas, intrigued, smiled at his mother, softly caressing her hand. The journey begins. 2014 The sacred call of evolution for warriors has been revealed. Talula, Cleo, Admin, Ham, Call Filma, and Nickel, they are to receive their spiritual istis, which was when skills, powers and talents of their reincarnates are bestowed upon them. In this celebration, the chosen warriors are 14. They are called to enter the sacred temple, where ritual and covenant rites are performed by the Holy of Holiest. These Holy of Holiest travel down from the heavens. They are David the Archangel, Michael the Archangel, and Jehovah. Their parents remain outside to celebrate their children's transformation into reincarnate warriors. The ritual is only known to a few. The called warriors, who are transformed from 14 to 20-year-olds, in the temple ceremony was astonishing. The reincarnates were given their birthright of special powers and authorities over their mission at hand. They left the temple as adults, transformed. The families amazed at the sight of their once children. 1 week later, September the 9th. The time had come for new warriors to leave the city. 7 older warriors were each assigned a small group of new ordained warriors. They set out to all 4 corners of the world. 5 groups flew on planes named the Ikits, which were large oval jets that could fly over many oceans to their destination. Never needing to refuel, they flew on energy absorbed from the sun. The rest of the groups set out on foot into the forests of Lilith. Kalob's and Jija's groups were on foot. Jija, a spiritual wonder, was a warrior of good, purity, and wisdom. He held the keys of discernment and falsehood. He was a master swordsman and wore 1 gold earring on his right ear to remind him to hear God's words. His group consisted of Call Filma, Admin, Cleo and Reem. Call Filma was crafty at any device. He could make sense of any machinery and had a master's mind for technology. He loved to work with metals of all kinds and designed the perfect curved sword, which could be thrown to slice through your objective and would return to its wielder's hand. Admeng could channel into a chameleon and blend into any scenery. Cleo had the ability to take flight and fly, along with hawk intuition. She could sense any witchery miles away. Reem, the twin of Wiend, carried the same powers as his brother, born moments before him. All these warriors were given insight and powers to dominate evil in any form. Some wore the breastplate that held special meaning to them and God. Many had devised symbols of their own and etched them on the plates, to remind them of God's plan for all mankind, and to represent their own destiny. Kalob, Talula, Nickel, Wient and Ham left the city walls to go east. First they had to claim a symbolic stone that rested in Eden, called the Urim and Thummim, which was protected by God's power. These stones would give Kalob great powers and knowledge that he would see in the stone. The stone was a visionary concubule, meaning a sort of heavenly cell phone. The other groups flew east to observe religious wars. Soldiers from all corners of the world fought in the lands of Arabia and Persia. Many people had hatred in their hearts against peaceful societies. They wanted dominance and destruction in the name of their god. Jija and his warriors would be the first group to leave the confines of Metamorn. The rest would join him after their destinies were completed. The beauty of the forest was exotic and intoxicating, with dense green ferns and redwood trees. Although they knew all Lilith's eyes were on the warriors, they hiked through the woods, going east. Lilith sent her spies to watch the warriors to discern their motives for leaving the city walls. The Kokrian inched ever closer. No one spoke. They communicated telepathically. Although unknown by the warriors, the Kokrian could hear their thoughts. Lilith resided just outside of Eden. She still considered it her home after she was cast out. Lilith maintained her adversaries' emotions upon Adam's firstborn sons Cain and Abel. Abel did not listen to Lilith's enticing words, but Cain had been mesmerized by her beauty and absorbed her contentious thoughts. He became evil. Cain slew his brother and lied to God about Abel's whereabouts. Cain was then removed from Adam and Eve's presence with his wife and family. Their bodies took on an animal form and stench. They left the forest and traveled north, wandering the lands upright, with arms hanging low and swinging with every step. In modern times, they had been sighted by humans. Thus the legend of Bigfoot springs from the sightings of Cain and his family. Talula was the first to spot the Kokrians. The Kokrian had a narrow window on scent. They couldn't smell prey behind them, only in front. They traveled in a circular motion to cover their blind spots and worked as a group to protect one another. Kalob, Ham, and Talula split off from the others. Wient and Nickel stayed on the journey to Eden. Kalob stood in front of a dozen Kokrian. Ham was by his side, with his eyes fixated on the Kokrians' hearts to bring them to a lethargic beat. Talula tried to stealthily get behind them and attack their blind spot. The Kokrian kept moving to prevent Talula's attack. Ham was unsuccessful in his attempt to slow their black hearts. Kalob, I can't penetrate their hearts, they are too dense. Kalob nodded, watching the Kokrian closely. The Kokrian were transmitting information to Lilith. She instructed them telepathically to attack and shred the warrior apart. The largest of the Kokrian deciphered that Kalob was the leader, and they targeted him. The Kokrian lunged for his jugular as others followed. Kalob held his blessed staff in front of him, which created a thin, invisible shield of protection. Most of the Kokrians slammed into it and fell back, unconscious. Talula stabbed each in their triangle and they dissipated. 3 went after Talula. She crouched down and leapt straight up into the top of the tree. A few Kokrians slithered to Ham and encircled Kalob, to bypass his shield. Ham grabbed 2 of his arrows and aimed at the triangle. The best position for the arrows was when the Kokrian pounced upon their prey. He then would have a clear shot. Ham telepathically told Talula to shoot with her blessed arrow, and she fired from the top of the tree. They dissipated 4 more Kokrian. The other Kokrian attempted to break through Kalob's shield. Talula saw a motion in the trees, coming toward her. She balanced herself on the tree branches and squinted to see what was coming at her. As it approached, she aimed her arrow, but the demon darted quickly out of her aim. It swooped up and around, tearing her out of the tree. Before she realized what had happened, she was falling. Ham looked up just in time to see Talula falling and ran to catch her. As he rushed to her, a Kokrian leaped at him. Ham grabbed an arrow and wrestled with the Kokrian. With its mouth seething with foam and emitting a foul stench, they rolled on the forest ground fighting. Ham tried to keep the Kokrian's teeth away. He could see Talula had flipped her body and landed on her feet, even to her own surprise. Swoosh! The entity whisked by her face and sliced at her cheek. Kalob held his shield and came to Talula's defense. It flew up and down amongst the trees and was coming back once again for Talula. Kalob braced himself and waited till the entity passed him. He stabbed it with his staff. It spun out of control and vaporized. Lilith observed the fight from her tree fortress. She gathered information on why these warriors had left the safety of Metria. On the other side of the forest, Gija's group was also deep in battle with the Kokrian and evil entities. Their cuts were poisoned. Talula's best friend, Cleo, was cut in half by an entity as she took flight out of the battle. As Gija's warriors fought, the entities grew stronger, swifter, and their cuts more fatal. Rin perceived that the entities grew from the warriors' intense emotions. After all the Kokrian were slain, Gija dropped his sword and commanded the others to do so as well. They knelt in a circle and bowed before their lord. The entities swirled around them, swooping down and trying to cut them, but became aimless and weak. Not one warrior picked up his sword, and soon the entities dropped to the forest ground and dissipated into thin air. The warriors discovered that the energy for these entities was controlled by intense emotions while in battle, and it strengthened them. When the warriors dropped their weapons and prayed, there was no more resistant energy to gather. The entities weakened and flew aimlessly, then crumbled to dust. Gija praised Dream's insight, and they proceeded on foot to the war in the north. Gija blessed the wounds of his warriors and they were healed. Cleo's warrior spirit followed in a translucent spirit glow. She flew through the trees to guide them. Although her mortal body had perished, her spirit was real. Lilith, frustrated at the warriors' success, called upon Menad to devise new witchery to overcome the warriors. Menad complied. He gave her more power than before. He watched the warriors in flight on the Ikits. He knew they set out to destroy his mortal stepbrother. The city of Metria was of 2 words, metropolitan and morning, celebrated as the city of the morn. It represented a city of the morning of the first resurrection, when the world would be cleansed and those inhabitants left would come forth and delight in the light of God. The city would be further renewed to hold all the righteous for 1,000 years. The city as it stood was quite large and spectacular, with tall, ornate buildings and gleaming streets. Metria was framed by large, lush mountains with waterfalls that irrigated the city. The trees had continuous foliage of brilliant greens. The grounds were splattered with flowers of all varieties, in vivid colors, even colors never seen by mortal man. Men and women worked in the tall buildings and resided in homes to the left side of the city. Each home was designed by the family that resided within. The Holy Temple lay in the center of the city and was small in comparison to the skyscrapers all around it. The technology was direct from God and his angels. Angels walked amongst the dwellers and helped to inspire them in all their thoughts and deeds. There was no crime or fornication in the city. All was of God and exuded his will. Academics in Metria were transmitted to the outside world. Technology was given to recipients in all areas of the continents. Eden, hidden deep in the forest, was protected by God's sentinels. No one knew its whereabouts only the divine warriors, Lilith, Samuel, and Menad. It was framed with an ornate gate, which held a secret password in the first language that was of Adam, for those who were called upon by Elohim to enter. Kalob, beloved by God, was given this password. The legacy was his to retrieve the Urim and Thummim and learn of his destiny. The Urim and Thummim was a white stone placed in the garden by God. It revealed all that is asked and showed many things to the beholder. It would lose its power in the wrong hands, and thus be retrieved back to the heavens. When carried by Kalob, it will direct him steadfastly by God. Also while in the garden he would receive a globular compass. It'll lead the warriors to the edge of the forest, where their mission is to begin. Small, fairy-like white orbs encircled the warriors and led them to Eden. It was about nightfall. The fairy orbs brightened the path. They could rest once they are in the gates of Eden. Tallulah sensed evil and halted in her path. She held her arm in a silent signal for all to be on alert. Sure enough, danger was up ahead. Wind began to whirl about them. Tallulah needed to rise up above the woods to see the enemy. She flew straight up and was caught in a wind tunnel. She was tossed and thrown about. Tallulah resisted its force and flew till she could observe from the tops of the great redwood trees. Tallulah laid eyes on many figures moving quickly toward the group. She looked east and noticed the Golden Gates just minutes away. She swooped down to warn the others of the impending evil. Kalob instructed the group to move swiftly and get to the front gate. He told them 2 sentinels were waiting with further instructions. Tallulah stayed in flight while Ham and Weend fell behind to protect Kalob and Nickel as they raced to the gates. Ham turned to see the predators at his heel, and fell to the ground as he looked upon the hideous creatures. These monsters stood upright in stature with abominable hair, black eyes and a dark face. Ham was terrified and lay frozen on the forest floor. He raised his arms to protect his face as a creature reached down, grabbed his body and lifted him up. Weend flung himself at the ugly creature's neck. He stabbed a blessed arrow into the forehead of the entity. It flung back and forth to shake Weend off, but strongest of all, he held on as he pushed the arrow deeper into the skull of the creature. Finally, the monster fell, dropping Ham several feet. These creatures stood taller than the warriors. They gnashed their teeth. Their ears hung low and waved back and forth as they ran with a sway. Their arms were twice the length of their torso with claws. Their faces and bodies were covered with long, grey spindly hair. Their faces were flat, with only holes for the nose. The eyes laid inward on the face and a sludge ran out of them. A roar came hurtling out of their mouths as they pursued the warriors. Kalob and Nickel came upon the entrance of the Golden Gate. Kalob stood in front of a sentinel and raised his arm in a square, and gave the sacred 3 words, Peel. The sentinel said, "That is correct," and unlocked the gate with a golden key. Then the sentinels rose up their arms to the heavens as a spray of protective energy encompassed the warriors and led them all to safety. Kalob entered Eden first, then Nickel. Tallulah landed in front of the gate and walked through. Weend observed the wave of brilliant energy that surrounded him and Ham, which stopped the evil monsters. Weend carried Ham through the gates of Eden, and the sentinels closed them. Ham's ribs were crushed. He grunted in pain. Kalob looked around at the ethereal sight of the Garden of Eden. He turned to the warriors and said, "Rest now, I will explore the garden. Take heed of Ham, I will be about God's will." The warriors obeyed and laid hands on Ham to bless him and ease his pain. Kalob walked along the garden's path. Several rivers flowed through Eden. Moonlight bounced in the water's reflection. Kalob stopped and looked deep into the river and gazed upon amazing fish with brilliant colors. They appeared to speak to each other. The water looked alive as it flowed with purpose. The river took a turn and separated into 4 smaller rivers that flowed underground as it flowed past the gates. The great river of Eden flowed under the forests of Lilith. Eden was full of green vegetation everywhere, with perfect leaves. The garden was dotted with more dazzling flowers than Kolob had seen in Metria. All of the trees were strong and free from disease. The sky was midnight blue with streaks of deep azure. He looked up and laid eyes upon a man dressed in a long white robe with a blue, rope-like tassel sash tied at his waist. He had long blonde hair and a full beard. The man pointed deeper into the garden, and directed Kolob to proceed on the path. Kolob obeyed and walked on, basking in the gloriousness of the garden where fowl and beast lived in harmony. He came to a clearing where several men were waiting for him. They were wearing the same white clothes as the sentinels. These men had all colors of skin: dark, medium, and fair. The man of darkest skin spoke to Kolob first. He appeared to be the leader. "We have been anticipating your arrival. We have watched the beasts attack from the forests of Lilith and cannot deny her wickedness. We must muddle her mind as she observes your powers. In so doing this, we will curse her. She will become old and her body will be riddled with illness. She will lose the strength to carry out your destruction. We are bound to do as much as we can to help you." He placed his hand on Kolob's right shoulder and whispered a prayer of worship and protection. 4 ladies in white gowns came out of the estate of Edom to tend to Ham. They were of all different sizes, but seemed to be around the age of 30. He relaxed as the pain lessened. They took Ham and said he would return anew. Nickel went with them. She was interested in their celestial glow. Talula and Wient decided to rest and find food to replenish themselves for the long journey ahead. They ate the fruit and berries that were plentiful in Eden. Night became dark and dense in the garden. Talula fell asleep first, next to Wient, who eventually fell asleep propped up on a great redwood tree. While the warriors were sleeping, Kolob was taken to the far east corner of the garden, where a large oblong stone lay with a crudely carved stone on top. It looked like an altar. The dark-skinned man told Kolob that this was where Adam knelt in prayer and received knowledge and inspiration from God. Kolob walked to the stone altar. It did not look like much, but was sacred. The dark-skinned man was joined by 2 other men who stood by his side. "I am Adam and this is my home." Kolob fell to his knees, stunned that the man who had walked with him was the Adam of Eden. Adam said, "Arise and talk with me. I have much to teach you and show you in a short amount of time." Adam had deep brown eyes and big features. His hair was full of curls and short compared to Kolob's, which touched his shoulders. Adam told Kolob the secrets of Satan and the Antichrist. The Antichrist was not yet at full power but would be very soon. The man standing on Adam's right side stepped forth. "I am Paul the Apostle. I have been sent here to bring you the secrets of the sacred stone, the Urim and Thummim. It will guide you in your quest and will show you everything that God wishes for you to see. Only you are endowed to witness the stone's power. You will learn to master the stone and all it holds. You have been charged by me, Paul, to follow God's will in all things." Paul handed Kolob a white marble stone, about 5 inches long and 4 inches wide. It had a dip in the center of the stone, where a second piece of stone fit the top like a piece of a puzzle. Kolob felt warmth coming from the stone as he held it in his hands. The 3rd man came forth and said his name was Michael, the archangel of God. "I will give the sacred motions that you will need to fight against evil." Kolob received information and sacred powers. At this time a flow of bright energy whisked around Talula as she slept, and entered into her body. Talula awoke to a glow pulsating out of her skin near her heart. At first she panicked, but felt oddly calm as the glow dimmed from her chest. She shook her head and thought she must have been dreaming. Kolob next was taken to the tree of life that was protected by cherubim. The cherubim floated in the air with such grace as to be dancing. Their small wings carried them delicately in the air. They had the face and body of a baby and were round and plump, but they harnessed wickedly sharp tiny swords. The tree of life was a vision of brilliance. Spectacular brightness flowed from the foliage. Each leaf had a life of its own. A rainbow framed the tree. It shimmered high into the azure sky and sparkled amidst the moonlight rays. Then Adam brought Kalob to the tree of life to be in his presence and speak with him. Adam departed, leaving Kalob to God. At daybreak, Kalob gathered his warriors together to instruct them the plan of God and assigned each warrior his task during the trek, which would be played out during the next few months. All the warriors were blessed by Michael. Talula, chosen to confront the Antichrist, was directed by her warrior spirit, reincarnated Felm, to finish his destiny through her body and soul. She remained silent in her doubts of her abilities and moved stealthily with the warriors out of the safety of Eden. The warriors were protected this time by God's sentinels. They cast streams of invisible protection surrounding the warriors as they left Eden. Meanwhile, God was disappointed once again in Lilith, and cast sickness and age upon her. She aged quickly from an eternally beautiful woman to a decaying hag, became hunched over, and lost all her teeth. She cried and swore at God for her fragile state, and sent an urgent message to Menad to come quickly. She had been cursed. She squealed in anger, raising her saggy arms in the air, fisting her bony fingers. The golden globular compass guided Kalob as they trekked in the woods. Safe with the sentinel's protection, they were able to move quickly. They proceeded westward to a land of freedom and liberty. Talula felt a change in her inner being. Her senses were sharper with a deep clarity of mind that gave her more understanding of her spirit within. Ham, fully healed and strong, trotted next to her. Lai, which was his nickname for her. What happened to you in the garden? You seem different somehow. Talula shrugged, as she couldn't even try to explain her experience in the garden. Kalob raised his arm to the square and all the warriors stopped in their tracks. He sensed imminent danger. All of a sudden they heard tings and thuds surrounding them. They witnessed an incredible sight. The Kokrians and all evil slicing energies were bouncing off the invisible protection from the sentinels. The Kokrians stopped and observed the protective shield. Their gold eyes gyrated and sent data to Lilith, who was too tired to observe what was happening. The Kokrian watched the warriors, waiting for Lilith's instruction. Their growls and purrs were heard throughout the forest, but the now elderly Lilith was asleep on her lounge chair. Kalob and his warriors followed the path for 4 days and nights. Kalob halted the warriors and knelt by a redwood tree. He pulled out the Urim and Thummim from a pouch made of raccoon fur. We gazed out at the forest edge and laid eyes upon a flat, dry desert. Although the forests of Lilith had evil controlling it, the beauty of the forest was magnificent. To leave it for the first time took Quient's breath away as he pondered the desolate land. Kalob looked into the Urim and Thummim. He asked for direction from God and needed affirmation. He was instructed from the psyche of the Urim and Thummim to wait on the edge of the forest. A small caravan of humans would meet them there, and a few would travel with them to their next destination. The warriors settled in for the night, sleeping around a fire. They stayed up in shifts to be alert to any danger, but the night was quiet and the moon laid low in the sky over the desert horizon. In the morning dusk it began to stir in the far distance. Kalob could see a caravan coming toward them. The other warriors arose and stood at the edge of the forest. Chapter 4.